As I cover more and more film history, patterns begin to emerge. Most notably, entire genres come into and fade out of popularity. The Western and the musical are two prime examples of genres that have lost favor, while documentaries and superhero films are on the rise. However, without question, there is one genre that is more fascinating to track than any other: the noir film. Although an exact definition of noir is hard to ascertain, almost any definition will agree that the noir genre is primarily a stylized American thriller that deals with themes of death and tragedy. It's hard to define though, in part because the term is newer than the films themselves. Although technically coined in 1946 by film critic Nino Frank, the expression saw wide use by French film critics in the early 1960s, after people already felt the genre was extinct. It was coined as a way to describe something so familiar but unable to be defined, in the same way nostalgia was derived as a way to describe a bittersweet feeling that was hard to pinpoint. And although nobody could quite agree on what film noir even was, everyone realized that the hard-boiled crime thrillers that dominated the 1940s were all but gone by the 60s. But were they actually? It's important to look at where the start of the timeline is. For many film historians, the 1930s is around where noir really saw its beginnings. Like every film movement, it's rooted in history. So what was happening around the early 1930s? In the historical sense, America was deeply stuck in the Great Depression, but film was thriving. Following the advent of sound, improvements in lighting technology, and total dominance of the market by the Big Five studios, films were easier than ever to make. And as Americans fell deep into economic ruin, going to the movies was just about one of the only escapes that increased in popularity. Movies were a chance to get away from the troubles of daily life, and the Big Five studios were sitting on a gold mine. Not only did technology make synchronizing sound and camera mobility easier, but studios were in the process of buying theaters. This was block booking, a process which was so overpowered and in favor of large studios that it would eventually become illegal. But for the studios at the time, it was perfect. For each of the major 5 studios, they were really only putting out a handful of A pictures every year. Color photography was expensive and difficult to achieve, but it was important that audiences didn't stop coming to the picture shows just because there were no huge epics playing. And so they would force theater owners to play every film of theirs if they wanted the big ones. You couldn't just show Top Gun Maverick or Sonic the Hedgehog 2. You also had to play The Contractor and On the Come Up. For Paramount and the small theater owners, it was a win-win. Paramount got more money because nearly every film they made at a financial profit. And the small theater owners won because they got to show the films that audiences really wanted to see. In fact, the only losers here were the studio owners not a part of the Big Five. In today's society, companies like A24 or Lionsgate would never get their films in theaters because they couldn't compete with the onslaught of MGM or Warner Brothers Pictures. Sometimes these deals would include up to 100 films, which theater owners would have to blindly buy just for the ability to show the major ones. But while many of these less desirable B pictures have faded into obscurity, there are many which saw major success. For these major studios, they were pretty much guaranteed to make money, so long as the film was cheap to produce. And what made films cheap? For starters, shooting in black and white, or perhaps writing cheap, pulpy scripts to avoid paying quality screenwriters, or shoot with minimal actors on confined sets. Catching on yet? These are all the hallmarks of the noir. The studios needed movies fast, and noir offered the perfect opportunity. And because the studios didn't really care what types of movies were being made, it gave filmmakers an unprecedented amount of creative freedom. So long as you finished your picture on budget and on schedule, it meant filmmakers could experiment with things like depressing endings, cool angles and lighting techniques, and even more leniency with the Hays Code, pushing the boundaries of what could be shown at the time. In addition, many of the great noir filmmakers were directors that had been brought by the large studios from foreign countries. Directors like Michael Curtiz, Fritz Lang, and Josef von Sternberg had been huge in their native European countries, but when they were bought by the Big Five and tasked with making films in America, they weren't yet given the trust to make the huge A pictures of the time. So they were delegated to the B film and given nearly complete artistic freedom. This is why many of the noir visual language is rooted in foreign film movements like German Expressionism. Fritz Lang had been one of the key figures in German Expressionism, and so his American films were going to be sure to take advantage of that refined visual palette. And just like that, the noir was born. At the time, these films were simply considered melodramas, but as we advance through the 30s and into the 40s, they start to refine themselves. Even today, almost every film made is in some way a response or influenced by previous films. And so when the melodramas outperformed the B-westerns and B-sci-fis, Hollywood began making more and more of them. And so the 40s became the golden decade for the film noir. I figured I'd give 5 recommendations here, and to make things interesting, I'm going to recommend one noir from each of the big 5 studios we've just talked so much about. Let's start with the studio that maybe did it best, Paramount. Although I had many great options, I want to recommend Double Indemnity, which has all of the hallmarks of the classic noir. Double Indemnity follows William Neff, an experienced salesman who sells life insurance. He meets Phyllis Dietrichson, one of the all-time great femme fatales, and attempts to sell life insurance to her and her husband. However, Phyllis is more interested by the double indemnity clause in the insurance, which allows the receiver to claim twice the amount of money if the affected dies an accidental death. And thus, a murder scheme and hard-boiled investigation ensues. The film is gritty, tense, and full of twists and turns. Double Indemnity was written by Raymond Chandler, one of the key writers of the genre. In addition to writing some of the best pulp fiction out there, Chandler invented the character of Philip Marlowe, a detective that reappeared again and again in thrillers throughout the 20th century, constantly played by different actors until even today with Liam Neeson in the starring role of 2023's Marlowe. Another recurring detective was the stone-faced Sam Spade, made famous from one of the all-time great noirs from Warner Brothers, a film called The Maltese Falcon. While Double Indemnity focuses on crime and greed, The Maltese Falcon operates in the world of mystery and impossible stakes. Humphrey Bogart gives a career best performance as Sam Spade, a San Francisco private eye tasked with finding a small bronze statuette, a Maltese Falcon. Before the film is halfway through, the body counts are rising and so will your blood pressure. This film is so iconic that now all 3 of the bronze falcon statuettes are conservatively valued at over $1 million each, making them among the most valuable film props of all time. A lesser-known gem comes from RKO, as they had Jacques Tourneur under contract, who was another brilliant director that excelled in the horror film. However, my favorite noir from the studio is Out of the Past. Out of the Past follows Jeff Bailey, a gas station owner in the middle of nowhere in California. However, when a mysterious stranger returns to Bailey's quiet life, Bailey must leave behind his old life and return to a world of danger and corruption. Because these are recommendations, I'm leaving these plots intentionally vague, but if you're a fan of mystery and want to see a film that pushed the boundaries in 1947, this is a really safe bet. The film literally starts with someone throwing a cigarette at a deaf boy. MGM was known for their musicals, which is why it surprised me watching The Postman Always Rings Twice, a film so dark and twisted that it feels strikingly modern. Just like Double Indemnity, this film follows a single man and a married woman who plot to kill the woman's husband. However, while Double Indemnity focuses on the act of killing, The Postman focuses on the act just after. Lana Turner is a brilliant femme fatale, and ultimately I wanted an entire series instead of a single film when it was done. Both Double Indemnity and The Postman Always Rings Twice were inspired by the real-life story of Ruth Snyder, a woman who killed her own husband and received the electric chair for it. Like mentioned earlier, pulpy crime stories were perfect for adaptation because they required very little effort by writers. But one of the all-time great noirs comes from 20th Century Fox, rounding out the big 5 with Laura, which follows a detective who begins to fall in love with the woman whose murder he's investigating. It's as intriguing as it sounds. Ultimately, though, giving just 5 recommendations is not enough. This was the golden age of the noir, with each studio churning out nearly a dozen masterpieces every single year. All of these films come from the 40s, and it's no surprise that this is the decade often described as the best the genre ever was. Of course, all good things must come to an end, and as the 40s became a memory, so too did the noir. Pinpointing the exact end of noir is going to be impossible, because like anything, changes do not happen on January 1st, or the first year of any decade. Film's landscape is ever shifting, and the death of noir is perhaps better realized as a decline. As with any art form, by the mid to late 1950s, audiences began wanting something new. Most of the classic noirs are from the 40s, when the genre was still alive and fresh. There were still good and even great noirs in the 50s, such as 1950's The Asphalt Jungle, following a heist and how it unravels for the men who partook in it, or 1957's The Sweet Smell of Success, which follows J.J. Hunsaker, a gossip columnist who commands New York under his watchful eye, ending careers in seconds as he sees fit. When Sidney Falco enters the scene desperate to impress Hunsaker, he will do anything, including framing Hunsaker's younger sister's man as a no-good communist. Or even 1958's Touch of Evil, which opens with an unbroken 3-minute crane shot that can teach you everything you need to know about filmmaking before you have time to finish your popcorn. But by this point, the émigré directors like Long and Curtiz were offering nothing new. Long was retired, and many of the other legends of the genre were dead. Bogart was dead, one of the best from the Maltese Falcon. Billy Wilder, the great director of Double Indemnity, had moved to comedies, and of course, America had realized the A-list potential of this B genre. It's no surprise then that much of the great thrillers and pseudo-noirs of the 1950s and early 60s came in the form of huge color globe-trotting thrillers by Alfred Hitchcock. Why spend time in the seedy underbelly of New York when you can instead spend time on the nose of our nation's founders? The noir started so European, but it became so impossibly American. And while I love Hitchcock's films and consider North by Northwest to be maybe my favorite film of all time, I do think they contributed heavily to the genre's extinction. Noir no longer thrived in black and white, and a lot of the German Expressionism's tight angles and use of shadows got lost in the shuffle. And if you've watched any of my other episodes, you'll think I sounded like a broken record right now, but it is absolutely inevitable that every major Hollywood shift in the mid-20th century was the result of television. As we've learned, film studios perceive television as a threat that must be dealt with, and one of the major ways it could be dealt with was through differentiating the movies and the shows. That meant pouring millions of dollars into big epics like The Greatest Show on Earth, or historical epics like Ben-Hur. It meant expanding the scope and reach of films, and thereby eliminating the smaller budget and smaller scope films like Touch of Evil. Of course, the birth of noirs was in huge part due to block booking and the Big Five, and so it makes sense that the death is related to them too. In 1948, a landmark case of the United States versus Paramount Pictures was decided, which eliminated the process of studios forcing theaters to show their films exclusively. It was a win for filmmaking on the whole, as many smaller studios were able to thrive and gave way to independent films, but it was a loss for the smaller-scale studio films that we've spent so much time discussing. The 1950s were a tough time for the genre, but it really lost steam in the 60s and beyond. America had nearly abandoned the crime films entirely, with the only really notable noirs coming from the European countries that had given birth to the stories decades earlier. There are the French films of Jean-Pierre Melville, like Les Samurai from 1967 and Les Deux from 1962. The former follows a hitman and makes killing people look cooler than it ever has. The latter follows a police detective and feels like a mix of both the classic noirs and the modernist touches of someone like Spike Lee. The 1970s saw further decline, as crime thrillers gave way to political thrillers. The political thriller was maybe the biggest genre of the 70s, as a mix of Nixon and Watergate and the Vietnam War gave the public a record-low opinion of the government and their criminal acts. The political thrillers of the 70s are great, but ultimately they lack the sleek punch of the hard-boiled detectives of the 40s. Some of the best noirs of the decade echo these sentiments, like Chinatown, which has a sense of dread and hopelessness that feels so impossibly 70s. Jake is not perfect, he is not a bringer of justice, and he is entirely out of his element in Chinatown. The 70s argued that we can't bring order to this world. It is poisoned to the core. And thus, the genre died. As the 70s continued and made way for the 80s, film was in a really exciting place. The movie brats had entered the scene, and they were making films that offered something new. Spectacle, suspense, but most importantly, these films were made by young people. We were at a point now where the filmmakers in Hollywood were now the people who had grown up watching the films from the 40s, 50s, and 60s. The noir was in the past, and all of the new hard-boiled films were able to react to what had come before. It's time we talk about the neo-noir. It's a term I'm not a huge fan of, because it implies that it's something different than the films of the 40s, when it really isn't. Neo-Westerns are a thing too, and it feels ultimately unimportant to make a distinction between them. However, if I had to paint a major difference between noir films of the 21st and the 20th century, it would be the breakdown of audience and societal expectations. The Hays Code disbanded in 1968. It's a really fascinating story in its own right and most likely the subject of a future episode, but for now it's really a footnote more than anything. In essence, the Hays Code was a set of guidelines that major studios had to follow between 1934 and 1968, so essentially noir's birth through its death. There were rules, such as that no nudity was allowed in films. Homosexuality could only be implied and not outright stated, and authority figures had to be treated with respect. Like I said, fascinating stuff and really primitive by today's standards. Noir had always pushed these rules to their limits, in part because these B pictures were not as rigidly made as the A pictures, allowing them to get away with more. But as we look at the neo-noir, these rules are gone entirely. Look at Mulholland Drive, which is full of nudity, homosexual depictions, and extreme violence. Societal expectations for what is and isn't allowed in films has shifted dramatically, and these new noirs can include so much of what was only implied decades earlier. Those are societal expectations, but what about audience expectations? Well, one of the key themes of a noir film is that our protagonist has a drive. It's usually money, oftentimes women, and sometimes justice. But no matter what, our characters have motives, and we know why our heroes and villains act the way they do. Movies have changed somewhat in recent decades. They are a lot less defined, and sometimes these motives are absent entirely. In No Country for Old Men, our main villain is Anton, a man whose motives are never explained and are almost intentionally absent. In one scene, Anton visits a gas station and asks a proprietor,
"What's the most you ever lost on a coin toss?"
The proprietor is confused, but Anton presses on. He tells him to call it.
Call it?
Call it?
Yes.
For what?
Just call it.
Well, we need to know what we're calling it for here.
You need to call it. I can't call it for you. Well, it wouldn't be fair.
Anton treats a coin toss as the value of someone's life, and I won't spoil whether or not the proprietor calls it right. What's important here is how stark of a contrast this is from the original genre classics. There's no money driving Anton's actions. He could have robbed the owner, but chooses not to. There isn't a woman. One could argue his only motivation is that he wants domination over life itself. He enjoys toying with victims and making them aware that he will determine if they're worthy to live. Imagine showing that to the censors in the 1940s. Like all film genres, the essentials are the same. Good versus evil, a sense of dread, and tight on-location shooting. But the genre has evolved so far in order to rebirth itself, with surges in popularity as the fall of censors and generations of filmmakers have learned from and refined the genre to a point where it is as popular today as it ever was. While noir films constructed ideas of morality and ethics, neo-noir films deconstruct these ideas. Noir films celebrated man and his stoic lack of emotion. Neo-noir films touch on toxic masculinity and how dangerous these ideas can be. Ultimately, these are the same genre. They're just two sides of the same coin. This video was so fun to make. I love deconstructing such a fluid genre, and there's so much that I didn't even touch on. I only scratched the surface of such a deep well of great films, and I'd love to hear your favorites in the comments below. Thank you too for all the support in my previous episodes. I'm learning a lot with each video, and I can't wait to continue to grow from episode to episode. And of course, until the next time, I'll see you at the movies.